días.
Good morning.
Juan Bravo, consejero.
My name is Juan Bravo, and I am the Regional Minister for Finance at the region of Andalusia. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this international conference on economy and public budgets for equal opportunities for women and men. Once again, we are meeting in an online format, partly as a way to be responsible in our actions given the current health crisis, and also as a way of benefiting from the accessibility that digital technologies offer us. I would like first to say a special word of thanks to the guest speakers we have with us today, each of whom will share valuable knowledge and experience with us about the topic at hand. And of course, I would also like to greet all of those who are joining us online from the regional government of Andalusia, as well as other administrations and organizations, both in Spain and abroad, representing universities, the corporate sector, and civil society. I would like to thank all of you and welcome. I would also like to greet our colleagues at the Regional Ministry for Finance and European Budgeting for the enthusiasm and efforts that they put in making today's event possible. This yearly conference is an arena for debate and reflection on the many facets of public budgets as socioeconomic policy tools, with the topics chosen on the basis of the challenges and needs of the public administration is currently facing. Equal opportunities for men and women is one key area in which the Andalusian government considers to be a driving force in its strategy towards inclusive growth. And that is not only the responsibility of our government, but for each and every civil servant and member in our community, so that we have inclusive growth integrated with the European Commission's efforts, and budgeting can assure that year after year our budgets contribute to the equality for men and women, with a firm commitment that the resources that are used are done as efficiently and equitably as possible, and therefore increase the economic and socio-economic growth. And this year, Andalusia has developed a methodology that has been acknowledged on many occasions by governments and organizations around the world, such as the International Monetary Fund or the OECD, for its, on the one hand, pioneering spirit, and also for the level of development and its worldwide scope. This year, there was a little doubt that our discussion should really revolve around the budgetary analysis and public finance as a tool to advance inequality amongst men and women, and take us through a review of how public budgets affect the socio-economic well-being of both men and women. And we want to structure the decision-making process around results that are going to affect both genders equally and eliminate any differences. So a gender-responsible budget is a transformative tool and is also a very powerful way to affect cross-cutting sectors of our society. So the budget is going to allow us to incorporate analytical, gender-responsive tools, both in the planning process as well as the implementation process. And this is going to look at the special needs of both genders equally. Of course, this year we have to look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and we know that it has affected men and women differently, bringing about inequalities, some of which these inequalities had already existed before the pandemic, while others became more severe and were as unexpected as the pandemic itself. So although there has been numerous efforts to eradicate these inequalities, we need to continue working, not only because of social justice, but also because of the imbalances that this causes, for example, in taking away effectiveness and competitiveness from our economy. And if we look at some of the data for the fourth quarter of 2019, before the pandemic hit, the labor force survey showed that we had nearly 20 million workers, and of these, 6.2, so we saw that there were more women unemployed than male workers. And so even until the second part of 2021, the economic crisis caused by the pandemic has shown that the level of unemployed women continues to rise. And we are just now seeing the beginnings of the recovery. And so if we look at the figures, we're going to see that the widening of the gap was at its worst towards the end of 2020, but now we're just starting to see slight improvement. We also have good practices that can be seen through the management of our economy, and we're being able to see improvements. And very recently, between 1996 and 2004, improvements are substantial over that longer time period. So, of course, equality is a basic human and fundamental right, but we want to ensure that our economy is prosperous, but also sustainable and equitable for all. This is necessary for men and women to both contribute all they can, not only in the workplace, but at home, in civil society, in our educational processes, and in our economic systems as a whole. And if it's going to be efficient, sustainable, and effective, our economies have to be equitable and just and fair for all. And using the resources that we have at our disposal needs to be made available to everyone in an equitable manner. And so, as I've said, I hope that we have the opportunity to reflect upon innovative ways to not only overcome the pandemic, but of course, recover economically, socially, and so that men and women can continue to develop for our community's well-being. I would like to thank you once again for the work and effort you put into today's event, and to all of those who are going to participate throughout the conference. A very good day to all of you, and thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the Secretary General of the Regional Ministry for Finance, Mr. Ignacio Mendez. Mr. Mendez, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Bravo, our Regional Minister for Finance at the Regional Government of Andalusia, for your opening words for this conference. As you all know, this is an annual conference that we hold for the purpose of reflecting upon the many topics that have to do with public budgeting in Andalusia. And we always have guest speakers that are experts in the field and that have insightful contributions to give us on the topic. Today we have guest speakers, for example, from the OECD, from other international organizations such as UN Women. But before giving the floor to our first guest speaker, I would like to once again thank all of those who are participating in today's conference, from the Regional Ministry for Finance, for the Andalusian Institute for Public Budget Studies, and all of those colleagues who are joining us virtually. Once again, our conference is being held online. We've had a couple of editions now online, and not only this international conference, but other workshops and events. And the conditions have not lent themselves to having face-to-face meetings just yet. So I think it's a good sign that we have over 250 attendees already connected to today's conference, and we are very enthusiastic about being able to hold this conference even online, and making the most, as our regional minister said, for the possibilities that technologies offer us. And we are going to cross barriers in that sense and in that regard. And before giving the floor to our first guest speaker, I would like to go over today's agenda, because a few modifications have been made to the agenda. So just to mention the order in which the guest speakers are going to present their contributions. We're going to hear first from Alfred Trigla-Votel from the OECD, and then we will have a presentation on gender responsive budgeting in order to respond to the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic, and we will follow that by a Q&A session. And after a pause, we will then continue with the next three presentations, which will take place one following the other. So we won't have a Q&A session open for everyone, except at the after each presentation, we will have closed questions that we can take for the presenters. We're going to have, first of all, Elizabeth Klatzer, who will be talking about the EU recovery and resiliency facility. We're going to hear from Libertad Gonzalez after that, who is going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. And then following that, we will hear from Ms. Silke Stab from UN Women, who will talk about the global gender tracker system after COVID-19. We are going to be able to see how all of these ideas contribute to the discussion, and we even have data from the Bank of Spain, the Central Bank of Spain, that the COVID-19 pandemic has actually exacerbated many of the inequalities that already existed between men and women. And we're going to try to look at the different facets of those inequalities and see how they can be dealt with. And our basis for this is a document, as I said, that has been circulated amongst our regional ministry. And there are other prestigious organizations who have corroborated this idea, not only the Central Bank of Spain with its statistical data. For example, there is an overrepresentation of women in some labor sectors, for example, in tourism or the service sector. And these women are clearly being affected more severely by the pandemic, because those are sectors that were hit the hardest by the pandemic's effects. So we are going to look at how that severity has affected women, and we're going to go into that in more detail. I'm going to give the floor first to Alfred, who is our first guest speaker. Alfred is the head of the department for gender responsive budgets and public expenditure for the OECD. She has a master's degree in financial economics from the Copenhagen Business School. She is from Iceland, but before coming to the OECD, she worked as deputy budget director for the Ministry of Finance in Iceland, where she has also helped support widespread reform for budgets in after the financial crisis of 2008. So due to her expertise, both in the Ministry of Finance in Iceland as well as in the OECD, has a wide-ranging knowledge and expertise in the subject at hand, and has also extensive experience in green budgeting. Here in Andalusia, we also have the idea of merging both green budgets and gender responsive budgets, and we're in the process of doing that. And I think that's a very interesting line of work, and perhaps Alfred could also talk about that. But first of all, I would just like to give the floor to Alfred and welcome her to today's conference.
Thank you very much. And I'm again sorry, it's the essence of our job at the OECD. I got stuck in Korea. This is how we do it. We jump, and we had some technical difficulties in that presentation. But let me just say, I'm very privileged and happy to be able to be here with you today and present the work on gender budgeting from the OECD side. Just to give an overview. So gender equality is, of course, a fundamental human right. And in our analysis in the OECD, we have seen that gender inequalities, they persist in different aspects of life. For example, in education, in employment, in entrepreneurship, and in general in public life opportunities. And what we've seen is that, as I said in the beginning, gender budgeting can be an extremely important and valuable tool to have in place to both identify those inequalities and give governments the opportunity to address them directly, because we know that often the money is needed. You need to follow the money, so to say. So the budget process is an extremely important tool, way in to address those inequalities. So the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely highlighted gender inequality, so to say. That the pandemic has affected women disproportionately, and this is, for example, due to overrepresentation in care sectors, in services, in retail, and in other related sectors, and particularly also in an unpaid work. And responses to the crisis should definitely aim to promote a fair recovery, and they should consider short and long-term impacts on gender equality. And as we know, governments have been spending a lot of money now during the pandemic to address the difficult circumstances facing different citizens. And at times like that, it's extremely important not to forget about areas such as gender and of course green as well, because this is the time when you're spending money, and in many cases it's being spent without analyzing the expenditure in detail. So what we are highlighting to countries is that it's exactly at times like that you cannot forget that you need to take gender into account during spending decisions. So just to continue on this, the pandemic has increased and highlighted gender inequalities. The pandemic has had wide-ranging social and economic impacts globally, with different implications for men and women. And what we've seen is that the pandemic has increased existing gender inequalities for three main reasons. Just to highlight, of course, there are more reasons, but these are the three main reasons we've seen. As I said, women are the dominant share of employees in the long-term care sector, and they provide most unpaid work at home, which is very important to note, and we will discuss that in more details in the coming slides. And then, as I said, the women are more likely than men to work in social sectors that require face-to-face interactions and which have been most impacted by containment measures, as well as the sectors with higher non-regular job contracts and informality. And then, of course, this is another and of course important issue as well. When women have also experienced increased violence, sexual exploitation, or abuse in the current crisis. So the COVID pandemic has really highlighted this and really highlighted the urgency to address this. Just to give you an overview, I mean, you can see here from this graph that women are definitely overrepresented in long-term care positions. And you can see here the OECD medium, and then where Spain is located. So it's just very important to see this black and white, so to say, how this is playing out in different countries. Related to that, why COVID has disproportionately affected women. As I said, they have been particularly affected by the crisis since they represent the largest share of employment in the long-term care sector. And this has meant that women are at the front of the battle against the pandemic in more cases than men. In addition to the high share of unpaid work women already did at home prior to the pandemic, women are more likely to have taken on increased care responsibilities as the crisis have emerged. And this is still ongoing, as we know. Responsibilities resulting from shutdown measures, such as school closures and precautions for vulnerable elderly parents, have more frequently fallen under the responsibility of women, even when both women and men were expected to work from home. And this has become really evident during the crisis. I mean, when you have lockdowns, school shuts, I mean, this is something that I'm not saying in all cases, but in more cases, women have taken on this responsibility. And here you could see also interesting that women spend more time in unpaid work than men. And you can see here that the dark blue portion is represent women and the light blue men. So you can really see from this that time spent in unpaid work is more among women than men. And then time spent in paid work, of course, likewise more for men than women. So this is just to give you an insight, concrete data on how we've seen this play out across the countries. So also it's important to note, and we found this really interesting when we were studying this, women and men choose their workplaces based on different priorities. And this is just something, for example, that I had never thought specifically about, but it's interesting to see this, that you can see that female is the blue and male is the yellow section. So female more frequently base their work on commuting time. How much time does it take? For example, they take into account elements such as picking up kids after work, shopping, buying groceries, etc. While men more base their job preferences of payment. So this is important and interesting to see and highlight. And more on this, the consequences of commuting time. We see that the risk of leaving current jobs varies by commuting time. Longer commutes increase the probability of leaving a job for both men and women, but the effects are significantly, or at least a bit greater for women. And just to give you an example of this, for women having a 10-minute commute compared to half an hour commute to work increases the probability of leaving their current job by 11.6% compared to 9.1% for men. And similarly, women who have an hour-long commute are 29.1% more likely to leave their current job than if they would have a 10-minute commute. And this is compared with 23.9% for men. And just to sum this up, the fact that longer commute time to and from work is more likely to affect women than men indicates that women are more likely to take into account other duties related to being primary caregivers when considering their commuting time. So this is just to give you an example of how we have seen evidence during the pandemic of how this really has affected women and men differently. Also, just to show you this is interesting to see another example how the pandemic has affected women and men differently. You can see here the unemployment rate in OECD countries, that this has hit women harder than men, and also in Spain, significantly harder than men. So they are really different. You have to look at it from really different angles and perspectives and see how the pandemic is affecting men and women considerably differently. And of course, you could also look at it from other instances, but this is something that we've been analyzing. So to give you, to highlight this, in order to advance gender equality, especially in the current context of limited fiscal space, this is what we see across countries. And I mentioned that I had been in Korea earlier. I was talking about spending reviews, which is really something that's important to highlight as well, and we see as an important tool that governments will use. And I'll touch up on that, how that can be used with gender budgeting a bit later on. But in the context of this limited fiscal space, gender perspectives need to be reflected in public spending decisions and in recovery packages. And this is really essential to do, because when you're pouring all this money into the economy, you need to ensure that, you know, different citizens reap the benefits of this spending. So gender budgeting is an important tool in this context. It is the use of analytical tools, such as a routine part of the budget process, so that the budget can be more effective in helping to meet gender equality goals. And this can be a particularly powerful tool to promote women labor market participation, which can have a great overall economic impact. So it's not just something that affects women in that regard. For example, when it comes to labor market participation, it's really something that can have significant economic impact for governments and for countries. So many OECD countries are looking to the tools and techniques of gender budgeting to help advance gender equality and deliver on national gender goals. And we are working with different countries in this regard. And just to give you an example of the most common tools used by countries, for example, many countries use ex-ante gender impact assessment of policies. Also, ex-post gender impact assessment of policies are used. We have seen a rise in a gender dimension in performance setting across different countries, and I'll give you a country example on that later on. So countries have been increasingly using gender within the context of the performance budgeting system that they have in place. Of course, a gender dimension to resource allocation is also used, and this is highly related to the performance setting, and then gender needs assessments. And then you can see here that almost half of the OECD countries are using gender budgeting. And actually more countries are now in the midst of implementing gender budgeting than you can see here. What is important to note is that when countries implement gender budgeting, it really needs to be tailored to the circumstances of a country. A method that works for one country might not work for the other. What is most important is to kind of mainstream this practice within the government and really allow different stakeholders to participate in the process. So we see that it really needs to be tailored to the circumstances facing a country, and you cannot replicate what another country does, although you can build on good practices that have come up in different countries. So just to give you a bit more insight into this, what have been the gender budgeting tools that have supported gender responsive recovery that we've seen used in countries? As I said, countries have been using ex-post gender impact assessments of COVID-19 response measures. I would say, yeah, there are a number of countries that have used this. Likewise, ex-ante gender impact assessment of individual measures included in the recovery package have been used by countries, and also of the recovery package as a whole. Gender budget tagging to identify how measures support gender equality objectives has also been used. And this is actually a really interesting practice that many countries, or most, yeah, I would say a number of countries have been looking into using this tagging. Tagging is kind of like, it's not a difficult exercise to undertake, but it can be a really beneficial one to use. So you kind of just tag different budget lines or programs to see where you have gender effects or gender related measures. And this is something that gives governments the opportunity to map where kind of those measures lie within the budget. Also, a public statement on how the recovery package helps support gender equality objectives has been used by countries. Gender conditionality attached to support measures, training or capacity building in gender budgeting. More countries are using this. They're building up capacities across administrations to really work on implementing, strengthening the implementation of gender budgeting. And this is where you have different stakeholders across the government participating in this capacity building, and then supporting other subnational governments in the implementation of gender budgeting. So those are just to mention some of the measures used by countries. So I'm going to give you one example from my home country of Iceland. I worked in the Ministry of Finance, as was said, for 7 years, and I was actually leading the work on implementing gender budgeting in the context of the change in a legal framework around public finances in Iceland after the 2008 crisis, where the government wanted to put emphasis on gender budgeting. So Iceland has been quite active within this area in recent years. As in other countries, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted gender inequalities and increased urgency to take actions in Iceland. And this really created an opportunity to look for solutions within the government. So what the government did is that they created a baseline report where they mapped gender perspectives across the government. This really created awareness within for different stakeholders related to this important area, and built knowledge and networks. Importantly, it also highlighted data gaps, lack of data. So this has been something that Iceland has been working on, identifying with the statistical office to really create an increased or bigger pool of gender-related data. And this was a great resource for all gender mainstreaming activities, including gender impact assessments in Iceland. So just to mention a bit more on the data aspect, because we see this as a kind of an obstacle that many countries faced. Some of the challenges, they include systematic registration of gender relevant data, simply understanding the value of gender disaggregated data, and then more recently non-binary gender registration. And then just to give you some examples, so how kind of countries have been addressing benefits of capital investment, because we know that women and men, they benefit differently from capital investment. So just to give you some insight into how countries have gone about addressing this in the context of the budget process. And I mentioned a few countries in this context. One of the tools that has been used in, for example, Austria is gender perspectives to performance setting for capital programs. I'll give you another example of that in the next slide. In South Africa, gender impact assessment for capital budget proposals has been used. In Iceland, gender impact assessment of the overall capital investment program has been included in the budget. In Indonesia, cost-benefit analysis that take into account gender considerations to accompany capital budget proposals has been used. And then again in Austria, gender impact assessment in the budget execution for specific investment projects has been used in relation to procurement of trucks in Austria. And to give you two examples here related to this, and just to say, as I mentioned earlier, countries have been increasingly using gender perspectives as part of the performance budgeting system. And Austria is really, I would say, a pioneer in this. So they have a quite strong performance budgeting system in Austria. As part of its system of performance budgeting that was implemented in 2013, each federal ministry must set 5 outcome objectives. And importantly, one of those has to relate to gender equality. And in this context, awareness has been raised in relation to gender-related aspects for the transportation system, and then also in other areas. But Austria, what they do is you're allowed to set 5 outcome objectives, as I said, and then it's really clear, I think it's in the constitution even, that one of those objectives has to relate to gender equality. So Austria has been using this method to kind of align gender budgeting with clearly with budget process in the country. And then again for Iceland, the capital investment program designed for addressing implications of COVID-19 contained projects in, for example, transport infrastructure and building construction and maintenance. And all proposals from line ministries had to estimate the number of jobs created and the gender ratio, although this could not be achieved for all projects due to lack of, for example, importantly data and information. But in total, the Ministry of Finance estimated that around 85% of jobs created would be performed by men. So this is really important to highlight. I think this is my last slide, just to give you an insight from Spain. Of course, Spain has a long-standing practice of gender budgeting. The approach has been integration of gender consideration in budget processes, gender equality statements, gender impact assessments, and gender summary. The key features have been dedicated committee in Parliament, and, as I said, long-standing practice of gender mainstreaming among OECD countries. Challenges, much as is, I would say, in every other country, information overload. You can have too much information. So it's like you can either have too little information or too much information. And that can also be a big problem, how to make sense of all the information you have in place. I can say that it's easy to gather the data, but when you have to make sense of the data, it can be a bit more problematic. And then lack of high-level parliamentary engagement, which is also a common problem in many countries. And some of the legal and political underpinning in Spain, it first introduced and planned for equal opportunities between men and women in 1997. And then there's law on the effective equality of men and women from 2007. And Spain introduced specific methods and structures for gender mainstreaming. And then just to tell you a bit what the OECD is doing, we have a network on gender budgeting, which meets annually to discuss different approaches to gender budgeting. The next meeting is planned for May 2022, hopefully in person. And what is really interesting in this network, it really, when you gather people that have knowledge of gender budgeting, countries that are facing different stages of implementing or conducting gender budgeting, it really facilitates discussion and allows countries to share experiences. And what we see in most cases that countries are facing the same struggles when it comes to gender budgeting, same challenges. And this really facilitates that countries can learn from each other. And give you some example also of the publications to assist countries and compare practices with other OECD countries. We have a publication on gender budgeting framework, on designing and implementing gender budgeting in OECD countries. And then we have a more general, kind of like an overview of gender budgeting in OECD countries, and a more recent paper on gender capital budgeting, which is some of the examples I've discussed here with you today. So thank you very much for listening. And we, of course, are happy to take any questions you might have.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias.
Very well, and many thanks, Alfred, for this presentation. Yes, indeed, we would like to pose several questions, if we may. We've prepared a few questions, and in view of the time available, we might have additional questions from the audience. You have commented in your presentation this topic, but I'd like to know a little bit more about something in particular. As you know, the European Commission and the Council of Europe have recommended developing spending reviews of public expenditure, which is a measure that is also included in Spain's Recovery and Resiliency Facility. The Regional Ministry of Finance here in Andalusia has made progress in this direction and has developed its own methodology. And what we'd like to know is whether the OECD countries have been identified as having interesting examples of spending reviews in the framework of gender responsive budgeting. Thank you.
Thank you for this interesting question, and I'll offer my colleague Indra to jump in if she has some additions. And this is a very interesting topic from our side, because we are also leading the work on spending reviews within the OECD. But as I said, I mean, spending reviews are extremely important tool to have in place for governments, specifically now in the context of this limited fiscal space that countries have available. And we see, I mean, what we see is the trend, as I'm sure that all of us are familiar with. After the 2008 financial crisis, many countries implemented spending reviews. Many of those implemented spending reviews in the way that they were used to cut expenditure, find fiscal space for governments. What we see then after the crisis, when fiscal balances started to improve, is that countries started using spending reviews for wider purposes. They started using them to increase the performance of expenditure, to identify low priority spending areas and reallocate spending to higher priority spending areas. And then, just so I link it to this question, countries have also been looking into ways to use spending reviews and put a gender lens to them, because as I said, it's such an important tool to have in place for government, and most countries are using spending reviews. And they've been increasingly using spending reviews. I would say it's really at the infant stages, it's really at the beginning, but they've been using spending reviews because, as I said, you need to really align gender budgeting, gender perspectives with the budget process. And one way to do that is the annual budget process, but another way to do that is the spending review process. So we've seen that countries are now starting to look at gender perspectives in the context of spending reviews. So when a spending review is carried out, in some countries such as Germany, Canada, it's been done in Iceland now as well. I might be forgetting some countries, but this is countries are looking with one eye on what implications the review has on gender equalities. So as I said, it's really at the beginning. We're actually conducting a study on this now at the OECD as we speak. And we'd be happy to share some additional information that might be useful for your context on this. And related to it, because you also mentioned in the beginning on green budgeting, the UK and Ireland have also been including green lens to spending reviews. And what is interesting for countries, because we also know that when you have a crisis situation, I mean, it's difficult to implement new tools. I mean, the government is burdened with all kinds of new and additional responsibilities. However, when you implement gender, it's easy to implement green, so to say. So countries have been really looking into ways to align different PFM tools together. And as I said, really look at when you could do a spending review, you can put like on the green classes or you can put on the gender classes. I said I'd be happy to share with you some additional information on this. And maybe, I don't know if there are any additions from my colleagues in this perspective. But as I said, it's just something that countries are starting to do, and we'd be happy to share some concrete examples with you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of other questions. Actually, my second question has to do with spending. Well, not spending, but revenue. We know that from the perspective of proceeds can also have a significant effect on gender equality. So if you could comment from your vantage point at the OECD, have you seen any advances in recent years on how proceeds from public budgeting can also have an impact on gender perspective and gender impact?
Yeah, so I mean, our division is focused on the expenditure side. So we've been very much analyzing from that side. But of course, it's also really important to look at it from the other side, the other important angle, which is the tax and income side. I mean, just to put it really simply, tax policy can definitely impact women and men differently. And I mean, we can give you some examples on this. For example, in relation to saving patterns, I mean, men, and this is just something that we've seen from our studies at the OECD from the tax division that's also looking at gender. Men are more likely to benefit from tax privileges for private pension savings, for example. And then important, I found this very interesting on the tax kind of morale. Women tend to be more tax compliant than men. This is something that like our findings or the OECD findings saw. So just to give you two examples on this, I mean, we have different examples. For example, an example on under taxation of extra hours work. There are lower taxes on extra hours work, typically induce men to work more, which of course leads them to be more away from the house. So I mean, it's definitely different implications on the tax policy side. And just to tell you a bit about like how can you address this? I mean, I would say most importantly, like the first way that government should address this is to look at the underlying factors, I mean, such as wage equality. This is, of course, something that many countries have been actively looking at and encourage women's labor market participation, as I discussed during my presentation. This is something that sounds very simple to do, but of course, it's more difficult in practice to do. So this is something that we see for the tax side that's really important to address. And then, of course, secondly, I mean, can you change the tax system? And that's, I mean, probably easier said than done. And I don't know if I could give you one example. I mean, how this for a country, I'm always talking about Iceland because it's close to me, but I know that one example, in 2015, there were significant changes to income tax that were proposed by the budget committee of the parliament in Iceland. And this included the continuation of the permission to use tax credit of lower income partner. and it mainly benefiting men since they are the higher income partner. The finding was in 75 out of 100 marriages in Iceland. So owing to the introduction of gender budgeting, the Ministry of Finance was able to point out that this would mean that men would receive tax benefits based on the work and salaries of women. So this was important. Their disposable income would have increased as well as the gender income gap, contrary to the goal of economic equality between men and women. And thanks to this information, the initial proposal of the budget committee was changed. So you can see that really this can have an effect in practice as well. It's not just something on paper. So this is something because kind of the Ministry of Finance had advanced quite rapidly in the context of gender budgeting. They saw this, they pointed this out. And in many cases, it's just something that countries it's not something that they want to promote. It's just something that happens without anyone noticing. So it's really important to identify this and have the toolkit available to be able to identify this.
Muchas gracias. Efectivamente.
Thank you very much. Actually, the revenue side, as you said, has many examples that we could cite, and we will continue to be very observant and of those different models and examples. We also would like to know, we have actually a concern in Andalusia about how gender impact studies can be directly linked, or the results of a gender impact study could be linked up to future decision making in the budget planning. We do this in Andalusia through the audits of the gender audits on our budget planning process. And this is a somewhat innovative tool or instrument that we're using in Andalusia. I'd like to know your opinion. What instrument or what tool do you know or are you aware of that would help the reports on gender impact have an ex post analysis that would allow modifications to be made in the budget, or could be actually binding for future budgetary decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. And I know I don't think there's not maybe a clear tool that you can use, but I think creating awareness, political commitment, because we see that countries, they produce all kinds of gender-related reports, data, ex post, and I just have to admit, in many cases, they're not used for decision making. So I think here it's really important to highlight that if you have commitment from the highest level to implement the results, this will happen. So but if you do not have it, you can produce endless of reports and they will not be used. So I think there's no magic solution here, but I would really say that what countries have seen is, of course, making the reports valuable by having good access to good quality data, creating awareness across administrations in this context, and really getting the commitment from the top. That would be the kind of the three magic words that I would say in this context. But I would also say that this takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. And we see in the most advanced countries that this really takes time. And in some countries where you just in the countries that are most advanced, you do not discuss the budget. We do not discuss any budget proposals without really taking gender into consideration. So this is just something, as is with all reforms, just takes time. But I would really say that those are kind of the good quality reports, creating awareness and having the commitment from the top is something that we would definitely promote.
Muchas gracias. Tengo una
Thank
cuarta.
you. I have a fourth and last question. If you agree, we're taking up perhaps too much time, but we would like to make the most of your presence and ask you a last question. You've talked about cross compliance in gender budgeting in the Next Generation program. The EU has defined it as one of the pillars of this program. Presently in Andalusia, we are concerned about the gender tagging that has to be included when drawing up a recovery and resiliency plan. What is your opinion on this topic? Or what technique or what most advanced practices are being used in the EU in this particular subject?
Another very interesting questions, of course, all of them are, but this is something that we've been increasingly looking at in countries. And as I said, I mean, I think tagging sounds complicated, but it isn't so complicated. It's something that you can really, from my experience, when this was done in Iceland, we included tagging, gender-related tagging in the budget process. We didn't even know about the term tagging back then, but this was just something we told them to mark expenditure or performance data linked to gender perspectives. So I think what is really, but maybe the complicated aspect here is that you would need a solid IT infrastructure to have good functioning tagging systems. And this is something that stops countries because, I mean, I think the countries in many cases have a bit of an old-fashioned budget system, so to say, and it's difficult to implement features. Like it's difficult to implement performance setting within the IT systems in many countries. And then it's difficult to implement tagging as well. So I think this is something, I mean, of course, you can do tagging just like by handing in Excel documents, but it becomes more complicated to do. So I would say this is the challenge that countries are facing, how to really implement solid IT infrastructure around tagging. However, I would still say that tagging is a really useful tool to have in place. And it's not, what we say often is it's no rocket science. I mean, it's not something that you have to have 100% correct. It's just something, and it is actually something that countries also started doing in relation to SDG budgeting that was quite popular some years ago, and is still just for the government to have an overview of how different measures relate to different SDGs. And I mean, most countries, they prioritize the SDGs according to their kind of priorities. So this became kind of popular in that context. And also in the context of gender, it can be a really beneficial exercise just to say, I mean, yes, you have different budget lines, different programs, different measures, and just to tick the box, this is related to gender. I mean, it doesn't have to be 57.6% of the spending is related to gender. That is too difficult, I would say. So, but just start out small and just tag the expenditure and then go from there. I mean, and then try to implement it. A tagging module to IT systems would be ideal. And we see that in many countries as well. So just start out small, broaden it up. And I would also always promote that it is done by the ones who do the kind of who are responsible for the measures, because that kind of also allows them to identify where the gender effects lie. I hope this gives you some insight, but we'd be also happy to share. We have some reports on tagging that we'd also be happy to share with you. Maybe you find it beneficial to see how countries are building up knowledge in this context.
Sí, perfecto.
Yes, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Yes, this discussion is really important to us because at the Andalusian regional government we have the IT, we have the software available for tagging, but it would be good to know because you did mention something which is noteworthy, that sometimes we get we complicate things too much. I think we need to simplify, we need to be pragmatic and practical. And so when we have time frames that we have to meet and deadlines to meet, as you said, simplicity sometimes is key. So we will be in touch with you, and hopefully we can request more experiences and data from you. Thank you very much for offering that and for sharing your knowledge with us in your presentation and for answering all of our questions. And I would also like to thank all of those who are joining us online. And now that we have finalized this first presentation, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back at 11:30 for the second half of the day's conference. Once again, thank you, Efren, and we'll see all of you back in just a little while at 11:30. Thank you.
Buenos días.
Good morning once again, and we are now going to resume the International Conference on Economics and Public Budgeting for Equal Opportunities between Men and Women. And we now have, as I commented at the outset of today's conference, another guest speaker, Elizabeth Klatzer. Elizabeth is a researcher and international consultant who, for over 2 decades, has worked in the field of gender responsive budgeting, public financial management, feminist economics, and other related fields. She has a PhD in economics and social science and a master's degree in public administration. She studied at the University of Economics and Business Administration in Vienna, Austria, and at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She is also co-founder of the European Gender Budgeting Network and Fiscal, an Austrian network that works for gender justice in public finance and care-based economy. She has published numerous works on gender responsive budgeting, as well as on topics related to economics in general and feminist economic policy in particular. Among her publications, a 2020 report co-authored with Dr. Rinaldi entitled Next Generation EU Leaves Women Behind. This deals with the gender impact that the European Commission's proposals have in the EU's Recovery and Resiliency Facility. And she is going to talk about the gender approach, the gender perspective in the EU and its recovery plan. So whenever you like, Elizabeth, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Ignacio.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to provide some insights. And let me start right away. So as a start, we should look, and I'm trying to move the slides. It takes a minute. As a start, we should look at what are the starting points in terms of gender equality and the status of gender equality in Europe. 1 minute. At the moment, it seems that it's always, very sorry, it's always when there is the need, now it works. When there's the need for the network to work, it sometimes takes time, but here we are. Gender equality in Europe, by the way, it takes time. When I ask the question, where do we stand? The European Institute for Gender Equality has developed the Gender Equality Index, which gives us a good picture of the overall progress on gender equality. And the summary of the last index published recently in 2021 is actually that the EU still has a very long way to go to reach gender equality. And progress is very slow. The Gender Equality Index 21 uses data up to 2019, so it's not yet including the effects of the pandemic. I mean, the report does, but most of the quantitative data doesn't. And still, progress has been very slow compared to 3 years earlier. The index moved up by 0.6 points. And this actually is mostly due to the area of power, where there has been some improvements in terms of women in company boards and women in political positions. However, there is other areas where there is no progress or even slight regression. So the picture is a lot, really a lot to be done to move towards gender equality. Like if the current progress rate continues, we need quite a few generations before to achieve it. Well, as I said, this gender equality index mostly refers to data before the COVID pandemic. And when we ask where do we stand with regard to gender equality, it's very important to include what happened during the pandemic. And I think the first input already referred to it. Alfred has highlighted some of the important impacts. And we know that COVID-19 affected women disproportionately, and to a certain degree, in the words of many experts, including the IGE director, COVID-19 derails gender equality gains. This is in terms of the unpaid work, especially unpaid care work for women with young children, is rising enormously, even though there has been an increase of men's participation. The care burden of women has been even larger. So the care gap is existent, widening, and the care burden increasing. We know that it's been enormous in terms of work-life balance pressures, which increased on women. In paid care jobs, there has been an enormous increase of the burden of this care work. In the labor market, and we have heard already about it, and we'll hear about it from Libertad as well, of what the dynamics in the labor market are. There is a key burden on women as well. There have been high incidences on domestic violence, and at the same time, inadequate support measures for victims of domestic violence. I could go on. There is numerous studies available. This is just to highlight where do we stand, where do we go. The pandemic has actually put a lot of pressure and the danger of retrogression on previous gender equality gains. Even if they have been slow, there has been some increase, but now key important aspects are under pressure, and there is a great risk of damage to equality gains. So, well, actually, before I talk about what's needed, let me say two more things about where we stand in terms of gender equality. I mean, what we do have in Europe is a great development in terms of experience and expertise on the tools and methods and methodologies that are needed to promote gender equality. Above all, gender budgeting and gender mainstreaming in all areas, especially in the budgeting process. And talking to you, I'm so happy to be invited by Andalusia, as Andalusia stands out in terms of a very innovative process of gender budgeting throughout the budgeting process. Interesting, very important innovations over the years, a continued assessment and changes towards gender equality. So a really sound, great methodology that you are having. And As for Europe, there have been important steps and progress in terms of these methodologies on how to do gender budgeting. There's a lot of evidence and practice. In addition, at the international level, we not only have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which include an indicator on gender budgeting, which clearly says and explains on what best practice and good implementation of gender budgeting means from setting specific gender equality objectives to measures to adequate resources for reaching gender equality objectives. Not only in the frame of the SDGs, but also the public finance management community has realized that budgeting is only good and effective budgeting if it includes a thorough gender perspective. And here I would like to measure and point to the F.P.A framework, the framework to assess public finance management, which now has a separate assessment tool on gender equality in public finance. So where do we stand? We have clear and good and tested methodologies and practical approaches on what is to be done. And on the other hand, we have clear evidence of the gains of gender equality. Let me just remind you of the innumerable studies done on measuring the impact of gender equality on economic growth. For example, the study by IGE, the European Institute for Gender Equality, shows that by increasing equality, gender equality in employment, but in many other areas, there is a high rate of job growth. The estimate is about 10 million additional jobs due to higher employment, to higher equality until the year 2050, but also increases in GDP growth, like 6 to 10% GDP growth again by 2050 due to higher gender equality standards throughout Europe, and that translates to about 2 to 3 trillion euro additional. And if you compare that to the recovery funds, this is actually more than the whole resources mobilized for the recovery now. On the other hand, I could go on with more, but just one aspect, as I already mentioned, this issue of gender-based violence. And there is evidence that not fighting effectively against gender-based violence is very costly. Again, from IGE, there is a study that violence against women amounts to about 290 billion cost. And let's compare that now to, as I will be going talking to the about the Recovery and Resilience Fund. So we see that by it is like almost half of the resources mobilized in the recovery and resilience. So a lot can be done by putting enough focus on gender equality, on increasing gender equality, because it has high economic gains. Why is this decisive action needed to avoid retrogression? Because of the macroeconomic gains, as I said, because of the high cost, but also because a resilient economy can only be built if there is a strong focus on equality, and especially if there is a strong care-based economy. And by the way, we know that investments in care infrastructure have higher employment stimulus effects than in many other areas. And of course, in addition, it's important to consider that it's a right in itself to fully enjoy fundamental human rights. What's needed is this decisive action, and there is actually a clear legal basis in the EU treaty to eliminate inequalities and promote equality between women and men. And the gender equality strategy in place now, a union of equality, not only emphasizes gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting, but sets out a lot of objectives and a dual approach, also committing to targeted measures to achieve gender equality. Why am I stressing all this? Well, we will see in a minute when we come to the question of where is gender equality and in the recovery and resilience facility. So let me say first, I am focusing here on one of the key facilities, funds of the whole recovery package, because it's the recovery and resilience facility is a centerpiece. It amounts to more than 700 billion out of the overall next generation package. And what I will do as a next step, as I have prepared the ground now, is to go through the legal frame of the recovery and resilience facility and look what is there in terms of gender equality, and then talk a bit about where it stands in terms of implementation to have a better grasp on what is going on. So if, first of all, of course, it's important to look at the objectives. So the objective, of course, is one main objective is providing member states with financial support to achieve the milestones and targets of reforms and investments. So, and the scope of application is structured in 6 pillars, and these 6 pillars are guiding member states' priorities, because they are like the priorities according to which the programs need to be set up, the programs are assessed, etc. So there is 6 important pillars. However, gender equality is missing among these pillars. And one can say it's mainstreamed. Well, we need to see where it goes. But if there is no focus and objective on gender equality, the question is it really going to get the importance needed given the difficulties we are facing now and the challenges to gender equality? We shall see that later. So further analysis, not only the pillars, but also look at the general objective, which is to promote the EU's economic, social, and territorial cohesion. And then comes a long list by which objectives and way this is going to be done. I'm not going to read each and every of these objectives. You know very well that it's a lot about green and digital transition, social economic convergence, etc. I just want to point to you that in these objectives, there is no mention of gender equality. There is a slight mentioning of women by saying the general objective to promote union, social, territorial, economic cohesion by mitigating the social and economic impact of that crisis, in particular on women. That's fine, as we have seen, but by far it is not any commitment to really move forward on gender equality in the objectives. So then we look at the key tool instrument to bring forward the RRF, which is the recovery and resilience plans to be set up or already set up, as you know very well, by the member states. And the guidance and normative frame is that there is a clear definition of what this recovery and resilience plan shall set out. Among many other aspects, they should give an explanation of how the measures in the recovery and resilience plan are expected to contribute to gender equality and equal opportunities for all and the mainstreaming of those objectives. Okay, so we see there is no specific objective of the RRF. However, there is at least a call that there should be an explanation. That's something. And now when it comes to the, oh, and by the way, in addition to the normative guidance, there is a specific guidance by the European Commission, which sets out then how the challenges in terms of gender equality shall be explained, how the plan, for example, explain how the plan ensures and fosters equality, etc. So a bit of explanation. We come to an important process as the European Commission has a strong role in it. It drives the assessment, and there is a clear assessment criteria of how the RRPs shall be assessed. It's a long list. However, I do not find reference to gender equality in the assessment criteria as such, as it is in the legislative basis. Then, well, what else do we have? We have, and we know how important indicators are. So there is a list of common indicators for reporting on progress. Question is, where is there gender equality? Well, actually, there is 4 of these indicators where there is at least the need to disaggregate by sex, actually by gender. So there is at least disaggregated indicators, but all of us working on gender equality know that that actually should be a minimum normative for all indicators related to people. They have to be disaggregated. Otherwise, we don't have the relevant information, because a labor market participation indicator tells you not a lot. You need to indicate it by men and women and different groups, etc. Equally, employment rates, quality of employment, part-time, full-time, everything. Anyhow, so there is at least for 4 of the indicators, not for all, disaggregation by gender. However, there is no gender indicator included in their assessment framework, in the common indicators. No, for example, not even the main ones like an indicator to measure gender pay gap, which, by the way, is one of the long-standing gender equality objectives already from the start of the European Union and its predecessors. So there is no indicators on employment, horizontal, vertical segregation. There is no indicators on violence, etc. So there is quite a lack. If progress is assessed, it's not assessed according to gender equality. Then there is a recovery and resilience scoreboard, which is set up by the European Commission and which sets out the progress in the implementation. It has been published very recently by the European Commission, and it reflects what I told you so far. The only aspect they included on gender is that they have an overview of how much gender equality, how many measures addressing gender equality are in the RRF, in the plans by nation states so far. The good part, the good message of this is Spain is leading by far with having 30 measures related to gender equality. The bad message is that most of the plans, all but one, are far below 10 measures dedicated to equality. So overall, the picture is not very good. And apart from that, the scoreboard does not include any ways to assess gender equality. There is annual reports to be done, which are based on the common indicators, the targets, etc. So as there is little gender equality, again, it would not show so much. The review report due in about a year, and sorry for going in some details, is basically assessment related to the 6 pillars, which do not include gender equality, but at least here the guideline is it should include and show how the recovery and resilience plans tackle inequalities between women and men. Well, we shall see how far that goes. That's the qualitative assessment. The quantitative assessment is actually to what is the priorities, which is the climate target. There is a clear target of at least 37% of the funds going to climate actions, 20% the digital target, and the other quantitative assessment is regarding the 6 pillars. Again, just to remind you, there is no gender equality among the 6 pillars. And you would mean having such an elaborate and long history of establishing the tool of gender budgeting in member states throughout the world, one would know that it's very important to have quantitative measures to know how much money, how many resources are devoted to gender equality. So a target related to gender equality would be the least to show progress. It's non-existent. So we are in severe trouble as regards gender equality. However, there is best practice, even if not in the whole setup, there is best practice to be found elsewhere. And where is it? Actually with you in Spain. So Spain put forward a resilience, transformation and recovery plan, which has 4 cross-cutting objectives. And guess what? Gender equality is among them. That's what we would expect from the whole European Union. As we don't find it there, I'm very happy to see Spain here being at the forefront of showing what should be the minimum basis, include gender equality as among the key objectives. And you see here, it's ecological transition, digital transformation, social territorial cohesion, and gender equality. Going beyond just the gender equality goal, there are 10 policy areas in the Resilience, Transformation and Recovery Plan. One among them is the new care economy and employment policies. And I consider, I will come back to that at the end, I consider to move towards substantive equality and also to move towards a transformation and a resilient economy. It's key to put the care economy at the center. So I'm very happy to see that there is strong plans for transformation in the Spanish plans. And in detail, I don't want to go through all, but it's very good to see when you look at the plan in detail that you see gender equality in many very important areas. For example, addressing gender gaps in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, in STEM, supporting victims of gender-based violence. As I have mentioned, investments in the care sector, investing in early childhood education, in particular, a long-term care model, measures to eliminate gender pay gap, female entrepreneurship. There's a whole list, and this is only a selection. I'm not going to read everything, but what I want to stress it's very well integrated, and the measures are important in many different policy areas. And Spain is having a dual approach to incorporate gender equality and equal opportunities for all in different aspects, and the plan assesses how the different components contribute to these equality objectives. By the way, public tenders and calls are among them, and I consider that very important to integrate gender equality in public procurement. So we find best practice in Spain. So you would think, wow, even if there is not too much or not fully integrated at the European level, the European Commission would take the chance to promote Spain as a best practice for integrating gender equality and thus enhance other member states to do so as well. Actually, in preparing this very input for today, I looked closely at the website of the European Commission and was really surprised by the results. Actually, no, the Commission is not promoting Spain's good example, and much more so, it's not even mentioning the gender equality focus of Spain's recovery, transformation, and resilience plan, neither at the website when you read through Spain's plan, nor in the fact sheet, nor in the presentation to the council. You know, the council needs to approve the plan, so there is a presentation, and it's online are the slides. There is no mentioning of these achievements in terms of integrating gender equality. Only in a commission staff working paper, you know, the nitty-gritty details, when you go to the technical level, there is highlighted this achievement of Spain. But I find it very unbelievable, actually, when I'm telling you now, I'm still puzzled. Why is that not put forward as a best practice, especially as the Commission President always claims that gender equality is so important and is at the core of the recovery and resilience, etc. So there's a lot of words, but the question is, what is there in substance? And I have highlighted a few things on that. So I know I'm talking very long, so let me come to the very last part, and I try to do it briefly now because I want to give you a few perspectives on how to apply and how to deepen gender mainstreaming in the EU recovery facility. What would be the basic principles if one claims there is gender mainstreaming throughout the report, throughout the recovery and resilience facility? First thing, set clear gender equality objectives. And I'm very sorry that I need to stress that, because that should be obvious. Without clear objectives, you would not work in that direction. As I said, there's a lot of claim gender equality is going to be promoted, but you don't find gender equality among the objectives, neither at the highest level of the normative frame, nor in many of the plans of member states, neither in like when it comes to different activities, measures, or in other funds. When we talk about the whole MFF and Next Generation EU, clear gender equality objectives are absent almost everywhere. And then, of course, when you say and claim you want to move to make progress, you need to define clear interventions to address gender gaps and increase gender equality. Even that is often missing. There is only a claim that the interventions will contribute to equality. And most often there is no clear argument how. It's just claiming, but this is not enough. Given the strong challenges, it needs to be clear. Third, also self-evident, allocate adequate resources. And now we have neither adequate resources to gender equality within the mainstream projects, and nor, or even to say not at all, dedicated gender equality projects or funds. Let me stop here for a second to remind you that the EU was on the forefront, but well, that's already 15 or 20 years ago. Remember, there was in employment policies, there was a pillar on gender equality in employment. There were quite a few funds which were dedicated to gender equality. For example, like 15 years ago, or sometimes even longer, time flies, there was funds available for experimenting with gender budgeting and other innovative gender equality policies. Because of EU funds, a lot was possible. These funds are non-existing now, and this is a big risk. Apart from that, it's clear to set up clear monitoring and evaluation mechanisms for monitoring gender equality results, but not only some qualitative assessments and claiming there is so much, but real in-depth quantitative assessments. And best if it's done independently in order to not have a justification, but a clear, thorough, substantive economic and social analysis, and allow for participatory mechanisms to include gender perspectives equally in all stages of the management. To give justice, there is some provisions on including women and gender equal presentation in some of the funds. So the way forward should be all governance, management, implementation bodies to include gender equality expertise and have gender equality in its composition. I do think it's very important to set up now an institutional mechanism to set up to support gender equality through gender budgeting and gender mainstreaming in the RRF. The analysis of the current status of member states' plans, with some few exceptions and Spain being on the forefront, is very worrisome. So this support mechanism needs to be set at European level and in member states, and facilitate building of gender equality expertise and commitment among member states by promoting exchange of experience on gender equality, by demanding technical support. As I understand, there is quite a few funds within the Commission for technical support. As I understand, so far it has not been used or is not planned to be used on gender equality support. Commission argues the demand needs to come from member states, and I hope member states will demand for this to have this technical capacity being built up. A side remark, I'm afraid a lot of technical capacities that existed, like let's say 10 years ago at European level in many member states, have gone down the tubes, one could say, because there has been less and less importance to gender equality in the funds. I mean, now it's rising in terms of words, and we shall see how much it goes in terms of results. And democratic participation is very important. I talked already about it. Dedicated funding for gender equality interventions and projects is of utmost importance, and provide financing for a specific independent recovery, transformation, resilience through gender equality advisory group which should be linked, I think, to European and national parliaments and with participation of civil society and gender budgeting experts, because it's from there where there is more impetus coming. And finally, I have already mentioned it earlier, especially with regard to the Spanish plan also, building a resilient economy is only possible with a strong care-based economy. Thus, the overall frame ought to be building a just, digital, care-based and green transition and transformation. And build that with a strong public and non-for-profit sector. I'm stressing this because we have seen that the last decade or decades have put a lot of pressure on cutting expenditures and cutting within, for example, public health services and other public sectors. And we see in the crisis how costly that was, even at the cost of lives. So building a resilient economy has this care-based economy with a strong non-for-profit and public sector to the benefit for all, as gender equality is to the benefit for all. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. That was my input.
Muchísimas gracias, Elizabeth.
Many, many thanks, Elizabeth. We were delighted to hear your presentation, and you were so clear and to the point in your conveying your message, and all of the data you've shared with us is so useful. You mentioned Andalusia and Spain as front runners and models to follow for perhaps other member states in terms of gender equality measures and the implementation of our recovery and resiliency plan here in Spain. If you agree, Elizabeth, we have a couple of questions prepared. Alicia also has a couple of questions. If I may, I'd like to start off by asking you, this was seen in your presentation, we saw that really you have to assess and analyze the plan. For example, the national plan for recovery and resiliency has to be assessed, and you have to be able to learn lessons from these plans, and sometimes you have to reorient them and improve upon them so that the gender equality measures can, be on the right track. So my question is, when is the right time to do that? To analyze and still have enough time to react. For example, you mentioned that the European Commission really has not mentioned gender equality outright as part of the plan, part of the recovery and resiliency plan. So when is the time to intervene and say you need to change your bearings?
It's a very important question. The short answer is, I would say now and throughout the process. But let me elaborate a little bit. First of all, just to get my message right. I mean, when the Commission had, and I'm just saying one more thing about what I presented. When the Commission had presented the proposals for their RRF and other funds, it was basically completely gender blind. Afterwards, it added some things. And there is some, as you saw, minor aspects of gender equality, and especially there is a lot of words to it. So like commitments to gender equality, the European Parliament succeeded to put in a few aspects of gender equality. What I showed is basically due to the work of the European Parliament. However, it is sort of at the margin. So coming back to why this start of carrying out evaluations needs to start now. So what the Commission did so far, at least as far as I have seen it, and it's available like online in the scoreboard, is they counted how many measures did member states put in terms of gender equality in their plans? So Spain is leading by far with these 30 measures. Then there comes actually Italy with a few, I believe it's, what is it, 10, 13 or 15, somewhere around that. And all other member states so far adopted by the, approved by the Council, this is 22 plans, have only very few, far below 10, most of them. So it's not enough to do an assessment in saying the number, even though the numbers are low, but one needs to go and look at what are these measures? Is it only lip service, or is it really going to change? What is the potential of the measures included? And also, as there is a claim to gender mainstreaming, one would have to assess the main key measures in terms of what is their potential. Is there potential to contribute positively towards gender equality, or is there a danger and risk of negative impact doing harm? And I think it's very important to do that now. If we wait until the midterm assessment or so, then a lot of time is passed and there is not enough time to really go through it. And we know these processes. I have been involved in these European discussions for a long time. I mean, one thing is with the 7-year cycles of the budget, which actually could be more democratic by having shorter time cycles. So, and also within the cycles of midterm reviews and reviews in between, it's like very difficult to make progress. So an in-depth analysis should be really started now. And of course, now it can be only about the plans, but ex-ante assessment, and I suppose that was a major input by Alfred earlier from the OECD. It is also recommending to do ex-ante assessments. And then later, of course, throughout the process. And I recommend, of course, the Commission has the tools and the resources, has the resources to do so. However, I strongly recommend that this is done by outside and by independent researchers as well, because we cannot just repeat the story of we are doing so much anyway, but we need the substantive assessment, and it needs to accompany the whole process.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Le voy a pasar la palabra.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to give the floor for just a moment to Alicia, because she has a question, Alicia del Olmo. I don't know if you're ready. Go right ahead with your question, if so.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello and good afternoon.
Buenas tardes.
Can you hear me?
Sí, voy a esperar unos segundos.
I'm just going to wait a couple of seconds.
¿Ya? Sí, muy bien.
Okay.
Hola, buenas tardes. Buenas
Hello
tardes.
and,
En primer lugar,
and good afternoon. I'd first of all like to tell Elizabeth that we are very, very grateful for the time you have dedicated to our conference today. We very much enjoyed your presentation, and having someone of your expertise is really an honor and a privilege for us. So once again, many thanks for that. You're really a guiding light for us, and you've been very generous with your time. We have a lot of interest in what was said in your presentation on behalf of the people that are joining us online. They have conveyed a couple of questions to me. One of them has to do with the information you shared. And perhaps you could go into more detail about gender violence. And so we have a question about that. You said one of the areas in which the pandemic really exacerbated or aggravated the already dire situation was in gender violence. And I don't know if you have any further details about how the data or the situation has evolved during the pandemic, or do you have any final remarks?
What we have seen is that there is an increase of violence, and at the same time, there is an underreporting, often like the underreporting problem in terms of gender-based violence during the pandemic. In order to be not too long, I would like to refer to the homepage of to the website of the European Institute of Gender Equality, which has put together the evidence, and it is important to add to this evidence as we go, to deepen that. What we do have is, in terms of when it comes to providing resources, we do have actually a lack of that. I mean, we see it's a large problem and it's an increasing problem. However, we do see that there is no systematic how to say, requirement to put forward funding for fighting violence against women, and especially helping victims of violence, or even much less in terms of providing funds for projects to work on economic independence of victims of violence, to provide them like for their future. This is done in certain circumstances, very few, as we see with the example of Spain, where there is funds in the plans, but otherwise it is left up to the different member states. And I think it would be very important to to address this in a systematic way. And yes, I mean, what else shall I say? No, I think at the moment I stop here to give opportunity for more questions. We see an amplification of the issue, and we do not see the relevant responses in terms of fundings for the adequate policies. In some cases, we even see reductions.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You're absolutely right. Those are resources that we're not seeing becoming materialized. These resources are being devoted to other areas, and there are a lot of women that are in vulnerable situations that need this. And the next question is somewhat linked to that. It has to do with the disaggregated data that we have. When you work with gender equality measures, you need to have gender disaggregated data. As you so rightly said in your presentation, you have to have the data, you have to have those indicators available to you. It's not only disaggregated data on men and women, but also have measurements of the reality using indicators that really express the evolution of inequalities over time. That's absolutely basic in order to be able to come up with measures that can palliate those circumstances. So along those lines, the question from someone joining us online asks the following: how can you respond to such high levels of the submerged economy, the underground economy, that is so many women that are working in the informal labor market, for example, that are single mothers or women who are in a very precarious economic situation and are not really reflected in the data because they work in an informal economy. They don't work with a formal work contract. And so do you have any recommendations of how we could deal with that situation?
Thank you very much. First of all, I put into the chat, I don't know whether everybody sees it, the link to the work of EIGE on violence during the COVID, gender-based violence during the COVID pandemic, just for everybody for reference. Well, as regards this question, I have to say, in a nutshell, it's very difficult to give an answer because the question itself gives already the answer. On the one side, this is an area of key importance, of course, like this intersecting inequalities, like the migration status, the question of the socio-economic status and the gender. And we know that there is very vulnerable and very much affected groups, and especially in the pandemic, it's these groups affected most. And as you already said, Alicia, what we see is very little attention far too little attention on that by the authorities, and especially also in the context of the European Union. And there is some little projects, I hope they will be developed, and little funds to disadvantaged groups. But what we need to analyze and monitor very well, I'm coming here from the overall side, is what we need to do is monitor very well on how much of these funds are being allocated, being spent, and how much goes to increasing gender equality among these groups as well. So a lot needs to be on this following the money thread. The other aspect is, let me say a bit broader. One analysis from my side on what happens at the European level is that, of course, there is an analysis of what the challenges are coming out from the pandemic. And of course, there's a lot of talk by building, responding to it, mitigating it, and building a resilient economy. However, the main objectives of the overall recovery funds and package are different. They are to transform the economy towards digital economy. There is even 10-15 billions for military spending, which I always wonder, how is the military affected by the COVID crisis? So there is a different agenda which is at the forefront of transforming or transition in the economy, which is not necessarily building a just, care-based and gender-equal society. So that's where some of these gaps come. And then, of course, it translates to much too little funds for the groups that the question actually addressed. So what we do need is, apart from doing the technical way of providing assessments, monitoring tools, etc., is that it needs some outside support to mount the pressure or to put more voice to the demands of changing in these policy areas. So I'm talking about movement building, and I'm talking about, like we see in the climate movement, it actually reached already quite a bit in terms of more attention and more focus. And there is a climate target in the RRF. So what we need here to really change is the voices which demand equality, and especially demand equality and justice in this groups, among these groups which are so much affected during the pandemic. And there is hope as far as many people realize who actually is the ones who are upholding the economy, saving our lives, making sure that there is a possibility of good life and health treatment, etc., during the pandemic. It is these people working in care. It's mainly women. It's often migrant women also who are not advantaged, who have difficulties, little pay, etc. So people realize that. And I think there is a different mood now in terms of estimating and valuing these contributions. What it needs to translate to is it needs to translate into politics and policies which not only evaluate in terms of clapping or appreciation, but evaluate in terms of addressing their issues. And that's why I think like this outside support is needed to make these changes possible. There's a lot which can be done from inside, as we saw by setting up a good plan with the right priorities, but it also needs the support from outside. Long answer, but it's a long process to get there, to change what the question actually was aiming at. Thank you.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias,
Well,
Elizabeth.
thank you very much, Ms. Klatzer, for your presentation and for your answers to our questions. If you are okay with this, we're going to go on with the next speaker, Libertad Gonzalez, who's going to talk about the impacts of COVID on men and women in the labor market. Libertad Gonzalez has a PhD in economics from Northwestern University. She has a BA in economics by the University of Sevilla. She works as an associate professor for economics at the Universidad Pompeu Fabra and the GSE, and is specialized in labor, public and health economics. She has 2 grants to analyze the effects of public policies on public expenditure in child health and human capital. Libertad, whenever you want, you have the floor.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today. First of all, I would like to thank you for allowing me to participate in this event today. I have been requested to talk about the impacts that COVID-19 is having on men and women in the labor market. I'm Libertad Gonzalez, and as the Secretary General said, I am an associate professor here in Barcelona in the economics and business department. I am specialized in labor economics, and I'm going to talk about the labor market and COVID-19. As a summary, I'm going to share some data with you. I'm going to share the results of a survey that has analyzed how the pandemic has affected differently men and women. I'm going to talk about paid and unpaid work, and the key question is trying to answer whether the pandemic has affected gender unequally. The first thing that I can say is that the effects on the labor market have not been different according to gender. When we analyze, there was a worry that the COVID-19 pandemic could have affected men and women differently, but we have seen after this survey that the pandemic has affected both similarly. There is a recovery on the way, and I'm going to share the results with you. We have seen our preliminary results are that for paid work, there have been no differences between men and women. Nevertheless, unpaid work, here we do have some differences. Lockdown and the pandemic has reported an increase in unpaid work at home, which has been and fallen over the shoulders of women in particular. The pandemic, particularly at the start, caused increase in the general and a general overload for unpaid work for women. As a result, overall work, if we add paid and unpaid work, this has increased for women in contrast with men. I'm going to give you some data and I'm going to focus particularly on two sources. I'm going to share with you data from the labor force survey that is carried out at national level every quarter. Tens of thousands of families and households fill in this labor force survey. We've been carrying out between 2013 and 2021. And we have also complemented this through Ipsos surveys. We have carried out these surveys among 5,000 adult people between May and November 2020. The year 2021, we are carrying out a third survey, but the results are not yet available. The question that we wanted to answer is whether the pandemic has increased gender inequalities in the labor market. That is the question that we want to answer with this presentation. If we look back, March, April 2020, at the start of the pandemic, several experts in economics and several researchers showed the worriness about the potential negative effects that the crisis generated by COVID-19 could have had on gender inequalities. They were worried that the gender inequalities in the world of work would increase as a result of the pandemic. There were three reasons for that. First of all, in contrast with previous crises, this crisis could have or could potentially affect women more. It was expected that the pandemic would affect more women-dominated sectors, such as the service sector. That is the first reason. Second reason, work-life balance issues. Researchers were worried that female labor participation would decrease as a result of a poor work-life balance, for example, if schools closed or because of the need to take care of care-dependent adults. Also, the third reason, telework and remote work. Remote work could affect potentially or could have affected potentially women more. Since this moment, we have been trying to analyze to what extent these forecasts have been met and fulfilled in Spain. I am going to share with you some of our preliminary results. In contrast with previous crisis, this crisis was expected to affect more women-dominated sectors. It is true that the previous crisis or previous crisis affected more male-dominated sectors. For example, the 2008 crisis affected the building sector and the manufacturing sector. These sectors were greatly men-dominated. That is why in the years 2008-2009, there was a high increase in unemployment among men, but not among women. Nevertheless, the COVID-19 crisis has affected the service sector, where we find many more women. But now we have some hard data on this. Indeed, we can agree that the most affected sectors have been the hotel and restaurant services. This was not unexpected, I guess, where we have many women. Some 54% of jobs in the hotel and restaurant services were held by women, and in the trading sector, 49%. There was a high destruction rate of employment destruction rate, but some of the sectors that have grown, for example, care and social services sector, have actually increased. The CIT's the CIT sector has also increased, and we have many women working in that sector as well. Sorry, the ICT sector. And because of the gender distribution in these sectors, we can say that unemployment rate overall has kept more or less equal, more or less even. The year 2008, the unemployment rate was much higher among men. So job destruction by sector has not affected women in particular. Here we have some aggregated data. Here we can see the employment rate in Spain by quarter till the second quarter of the year 2021. We have people between 25 and 55. The employment rate is measured by the amount of people that say they are currently employed in a given quarter. We can see that from the year 2013, both men and women job occupation and employment rate has grown at a more or less even rate. The obviously male employment rate is higher than female employment rate. This has been common in the past few years. We have seen the line that you have here on the screen sets the start of the pandemic. We have seen that the decrease in the employment rate was more or less equal, and the recovery in the year 2021 was more or less equal as well. In the next slide, I'm going to focus on the years 2020 and 2021 to see how recovery has been. Here we can see the change in the employment rate between men and women in contrast with the same quarter of the previous year. Here we can see the comparison, and here we can see the lines to different colors. Before COVID, the levels were in 2020 were similar to the levels in the year 2019. As a result of the pandemic in March, this affected second quarter of the year 2020, and we see a sudden drop in employment for both men and women. We can see that the drop is more or less equal for both genders. We can see that in third quarter, they are growing more or less at the same rate, and this employment recovery continues consistently over the next quarters. Men and women have achieved more or less the same employment rate in the year 2021 as in the same quarter of the previous year. It also seems that among women, have recovered sooner than men. So in the case of Spain, at least, this forecast was not actually true. This did not actually happen. At least in Spain. This could have been the case in other countries. Second question that we had, and that the researchers had, the question was, has domestic and care work fallen on the shoulders of women? There was a worry that women would, even if they stop or they did not stop working on their regular jobs, that they would have more homework and work at home rather. So we wanted to measure what was the rate of domestic work among women during the pandemic. When we talk about work-life balance and domestic and care work, here we have some basic ground. We know that in the last 40 years, there have been a great increase in female participation in the labor market for both in Spain and in other neighboring countries. This is linked to the reduction of the time that people, and women in particular, need to dedicate to taking care of their chores, for example, because of technological appliances, because of the outsourcing of services, and because of the provision of caring services by the state. As a result, women have reduced over the past 40 years, they have reduced the amount of work at home, domestic work. Nevertheless, male participation in domestic work has not increased over the past 40 years, which means that it's still falling on the shoulders of women in particular. Now the pandemic starts, and let's analyze what has happened. Regarding female participation on the labor market, according to the Labor First survey, we have not seen a decrease in female participation in the labor market in the year 2020. This hasn't happened for men either, but we were worried about the situation for women. This could be linked, for example, to public policies to protect work. For example, schools have only closed for a very short period of time, and the public and the policy for the regulation of work has also allowed for many people to keep their jobs despite the pandemic. That is why we have not seen a decrease of female participation, even if we analyze women who have recently gotten married, which is already positive. What we have seen is an increase in domestic work for women. This increase was particularly evident in the second quarter of the year 2020 because of the closing of schools. Women need to take care particularly of their children, and as a result, there is a general overload of work for women. But this increase in unpaid work persisted even when lockdown ceased. In some schools, there have been punctual lockdowns and there have been punctual measures. And despite all of this, women have continued having more work at home since the start of the pandemic. For this reason, we carried out a survey in the year 2020, a representative survey to 5,000 adults of 24 to 50 years in Spain to understand the distribution of paid and unpaid work within their households and the impact of COVID. First of all, we wanted to set the scene, to know what the situation was before the start of the pandemic. And we determined that women were mostly in charge of practically all domestic activities: cleaning, shopping, cooking, laundry, childcaring. There are other activities that were more masculine, let's say, repairs and home accounts. During the working week, women dedicated, before the pandemic, dedicated many more hours to domestic and to chores at home, more than women. As a result, they have longer working hours overall during the day. And as we have seen, despite the advances in the past few years, women still dedicate more time to taking care of their homes. In Spain, the year 2020, schools of all levels closed between March and September 2020, and from September 2020 onwards, there were punctual lockdowns. From September till July, there was also a hard lockdown that prevented, for example, people coming to help clean the house or the help coming home. That is why there was an increase in the amount of time that women dedicated to taking care of both their houses and their children. In the second survey that we carried out in November, December 2020, despite the schools having opened already, and despite normal activities had already been recuperated, women still were dedicating more time than prior to the pandemic to both household activities and to taking care of their children. I'm going to try to change the slide, if you please bear with me. Here you have the data. Here you can see the amount of hours per week that both men and women with children underage dedicate to taking care of their children. In blue, we can see prior to COVID, and in orange, May 2020. Men declared that they spend 15.6 hours per week to taking care of their children, whereas women state that they dedicate 29.2. We can see that there is an increase in the amount of hours that men spend taking care of their children after the start of the pandemic. But for women, we can see that the numbers go over 38 hours per week. That is almost a full-time job. And it practically doubles the time that men dedicate to taking care of their children. What impact does it have on the overall working hours of both men and women if we aggregate both paid and unpaid work? Both men and women have reduced their number of working hours for their paid work since the start of the pandemic, and they have increased the amount of time that they dedicate to unpaid work. Here we have a bit of a more complex chart, but I will guide you through it. Here on the left, we have men before COVID. Second set of columns is men in May 2020, during lockdown. We can see that the average man would work some 36 hours per week, and in May, since the start of the pandemic, it is reduced to 22 hours per week because we aggregate people who have gone to work on part-time, people who have had a regulatory, some job regulation, etc. We can see in orange the amount of hours that they dedicate to taking care of their houses, and in green to taking care of their children. And they both increase since the start of the pandemic. Overall, they dedicated 60 hours in total to both paid and unpaid work, whereas in since the start of the pandemic, the total number of working hours for men decreased to 54 hours per week because they work a bit more in unpaid work, but they work a lot less on paid work. What happens with women? Women worked less hours in paid work. The average woman with children had either reduced working hours or a part-time job. And since the start of the pandemic, they see their working hours reduce at work. We can see an increase in the amount of hours dedicated to taking care of the house, but we can see a huge increase in the hours for taking care of the children. So we can see that there is not a reduction in the overall amount of hours that they dedicate. Before COVID, it was 65 hours per week, in contrast with men, 60 per week. And after the start of the pandemic, the overall number of working hours raises to 66. Women are the ones in charge of all of this care work that we have been talking about.
And we will see that this is going to become even more exacerbated as the pandemic progresses. Now we're going to look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on households with children under the age of 16. And again, we have documented a loss in the number of working hours, both for men and women, which was fairly even between both genders, but there was an increase in the hours of work that were unpaid in the home. And this is what I just described. I didn't go into a lot of detail about the increase of the amount of work that men are now devoting to household chores and looking after family members. This has increased, but not significantly. But we are going to see that during the pandemic, we've also seen how many men have taken on the responsibility of the shopping, which before the pandemic was largely in the hands of women. But that is a significant change that occurred during the pandemic. So as a whole, although the number of paid hours of work went down for both men and women end up working more overall years and men less. So that is the preliminary finding here. And really the conclusion is that we have not recovered from this, even after the schools have reopened and shops have reopened. Because there is still fewer caregivers, fewer grandparents that can look after children and grandchildren, and there is still a lack of external services that are available. So these are some of the concerns that we had at the beginning of the impact, about the impact that it was going to have by gender on men and women. And the third area I mentioned was home officing or remote work from home. And in 2020, we know that working from home increased significantly, both in the spring on through the summer. Many women continued to work from home after 2020, after March 2020. And the increase in remote working has affected women in a greater way, because many more women were able to work from home. In terms of figures, we have 19% of women that were occupied in remote work, whereas only 14% were men. So the question perhaps this leads us to is home officing positive or negative for gender equality purposes? For example, if we say as a whole, work from home or remote working does foster better work-life balance, because and this is something that many women favor and consider an advantage. But if you are offered voluntary remote work, it's usually women who accept remote working, because women, especially those that have children, are using the hours that they have at home almost exclusively for attaining a better work-life balance, whereas men don't consider it such an advantage. If we look at as a way of improving work-life balance, it can also have a negative impact, because women can find themselves even more burdened with household chores or with domestic chores. So if we look at some of the recommendations and some of the measures that could be useful in terms of making remote working a more favorable circumstance for both genders, I think it should be used for both men and women. That is, in order to avoid overburdening women with the negative aspect of being at home, that is being shouldered with the household chores and with domestic chores. So I think that is my first recommendation, and I would like to somewhat bring everything to a close about the long-term effects that the pandemic has had in all of these areas. That we've talked about work, the labor market, about unpaid and paid work, and perhaps a few ideas about long-term objectives. So if we look at the long term, what we've actually seen is the pandemic was something that shocked us, and it shocked us into having to be more time at home, and women especially were confined to the home and were overburdened with having to homeschool their children, to supervise their education, as well as look after their children. And some of the potential long-term effects of this can be very negative. And so the gender gap in the labor market that was highly associated to maternity is still something that is affected, because when women become mothers, they are not only expected to look after the children, but they are often shunned from full-time work because of the fact that they're mothers. So, and that is not going to be overcome until we have the mechanisms in place that allow women to have a work-life balance. And the long-term effects are going to affect the next generations. That is, gender gaps in terms of maternity and paternity leave have to be bridged if we are to come to a satisfactory resolution of this reality. And so the gender gap, it affects women in terms of maternity, in terms of providing care to their children, whilst also being able to carry out a profession. So what are some of the public policy recommendations that we could look at to try to avoid the most negative impact of the pandemic and the negative impact of unpaid work? First and foremost, if we look at Spain compared to other EU countries, it is probably one of the countries that has left schools open for the longest period of time. Many other countries closed schools and kept them closed for very long periods of time. It's been a clear differentiating factor, and I think this is positive because it's good for children to be in school, and it's good for parents so that they can have a work-life balance. And so I think Spain in that respect has carried out a very satisfactory public policy. But secondly, the public policy has to be directed at compensating for inequalities in terms of providing incentives and some type of bonus for working from home, remote working or home officing, call it what you like. But that would help men take greater part and participation in domestic chores and caring after family members and children. And that way, just as we have instituted the paternity leave here in Spain, there should also be greater leaves of absence for men, so that women are not always left with the responsibility for looking after children or taking part-time work instead of full-time work in order to look after their families and carry out household chores. So I think I've really used up all of the time that was allocated to me for my presentation, so I'm going to go straight to the conclusions. And just to recap a little bit, the COVID-19 crisis for the time being has not greatly affected in a differential way women over men in terms of employment. That is, both men and women were affected in terms of employment and in terms of their participation in the labor market. And the destruction of employment really has affected men and women in a very similar way. And closing schools were brief, and if we compare them with other international examples. So I think in that respect, we need to take up the recommendations that I mentioned at the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for bearing with me. I've gone on for all of the time you gave me. Thank you for those ideas and your contributions and the figures you shared with us. And I think it's time to go on to the questions. I'm going to ask you a question first, and I think Alicia also has perhaps a question or two from the audience. The first of them is in relation to the natality leave that you mentioned for both parents. How is that affecting the distribution of household chores and caregiving in the home? That is, now that both mothers and fathers have paternity and maternity leave, is there Are you seeing a cultural shift due to this measure? Or what is your opinion with the data that you have available? Thank you for that question, Ignacio. Yeah, this is a question that I'm often asked, and it's a very interesting one. And I'm going to try to be concise. Paternity leave was modified and has been extended gradually in Spain. In 2007, there was no paternity leave for the birth of a child for the father. It was introduced. It was then introduced. There was a 2-week paternity leave, and gradually that paternity leave has been increased over the years, and now it is on the same footing as maternity leave. That is a 16-week leave. And so what impact has this had? I have good and bad news in this respect. The good news is that paternity leave is being utilized. That is, fathers are taking paternity leave. Heretofore, very few fathers used those 2-week paternity leaves and then when it was introduced that they could share the 16-week, very few fathers took their share of the 16-week leave. But now that there is an equal leave from both mothers and fathers, they are taking advantage of this and spending time with their newborn child. Now, the truth is that these figures are growing gradually, increasing gradually, because it is voluntary. It's not mandatory, but it is being utilized. But the second piece of good news is that our figures seem to indicate that the longer paternity leave is having a greater participation of men in caregiving in the home. That is much more than in past decades. However, the bad news is that we've also seen changes in the labor market and really the paternity leave is taken and then men go back to their positions just as they did before the birth of their child. So really there's no loss of employment. There's no reduction in the number of working hours over the week. So that's good and bad, because perhaps we need to wait for more developments to take place and the impact that it could have in the next generation. Because when it becomes a normal situation that both mothers and fathers are expected to participate equally in the rearing of their children, well, I think we will see that gradually we're going to be seeing a greater acceptance, and we're going to see less impact on the labor market, and we're going to see that women are not going to have to forfeit working full time just because they're mothers, and we're not going to see men saying this is a loss of opportunities in the labor market. Thank you.
Gracias a ti. Alicia.
Thank you. Alicia, I don't know if you have any questions from the audience. I believe you do. You've indicated so whenever you like. Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, Libertad, for your presentation. It was excellent, and it was very, very interesting, and I think it coincides with the fact that just as Elizabeth Klatzer's presentation, we've had a lot of interest shown from the audience. We're not going to have time to answer all of the questions that were posed online, given the time restrictions, but I'm going to ask you the first and perhaps the second, and depending on how much time we have left, perhaps we can have one last question. So the first question is something that has to do with the labor market. This comes from a colleague from the regional government of Andalusia. And the question is, have you studied the impact of the pandemic on how the type of contracts that are offered to men and women, that is, are the total number of working hours have been studied? Does this include, as you said, includes unpaid and paid work? If the total number of working hours is increasing, is there a tendency for women to take on part-time work instead of full-time work, given the fact that their overall working hours has increased due to COVID, due to the pandemic? And if so, do you think this will remain so in the long term? That's a very good question, Alicia. Thank you. I need to look at the data, and as I said, the part-time work is much more common amongst women than in Spain. And that was the case before the pandemic. And then many women have also taken on reduced working hours when they became mothers. So as I said, this was very commonplace before the pandemic. Now, what happens after the pandemic has set in? COVID-19 sets three different scenarios. We have people that remain in their jobs and they start working from home, remote work or home officing. And there are others who are laid off temporarily, and others are laid off for a longer period of time, and others lose their jobs. We don't see a lot of cases of numbers of working hours reduced due to COVID. What we see is women are devoting more time to unpaid work, and the number of paid hours is going down amongst women. So women already started with part-time jobs, that is, they've worked fewer hours, but we don't see a huge or a drastic reduction of the number of paid hours amongst women. We do see a larger drop of hours worked in men. So again, women continue to work more or less the same number of hours of paid work, but are shouldered with a greater number of hours of unpaid work. So as I said, this is going to have a more severe impact on women during the pandemic, because overall, all of these responsibilities fall upon the shoulders of women. So they continue to work in the labor market with paid work, but then they have a heavier load of domestic chores and household responsibilities. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes, it does, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for that detailed explanation, and that helps us look at the trends and the long-term impact of that after the recovery has started. And we're going to be looking at how the labor market resurges after the pandemic. And we've seen that we're already seeing the initial stages of recovery. And we have a question also from the audience about how remote working is becoming more and more common. It does have some negative repercussion on gender. So the question is, what kind of formula could be adopted so that remote working could be more equitable in the home? And I think that's a very good question as well, because there is a real risk of home officing becoming another two-edged sword for women, for the gender gap, because as I've mentioned, if it continues to be used by women working from home and having to juggle working and carrying out household responsibilities. So I think we need to do this in a more organized way so that not only can it be a voluntary measure, but I think during the pandemic, it was almost mandatory because you had to work from home. But now that things are opening up, I think there could be perhaps a rotational system put in place where men and women could rotate working some days from home and some days at the office. And so it would be a more systematic pattern, so that not only women are taking on remote work or home officing, but also men are looking at the possibilities of doing the same, and all workers, whether they be men or women, can benefit from the advantages that remote working has, but also take on the responsibilities that are there in the home. So I don't think it would be excessively hard to do, and I think it's something that we should contemplate as a way of overcoming those negative impacts of remote working. So not making it just voluntary and having women in their majority accepting home officing, but offering it as a more systematic approach so that the company does this on a more equitable basis. Thank you. Thank you.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias, Libertad.
Well, thank you, Libertad. We are now going to give the floor to the next speaker for today. It is Ms. Silke Staab. She's going to talk about the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker by the UN. Silke Staab, I believe she's here with us already. She is a research specialist in UN Women from in New York, and she has co-authored some flagship reports from the organization. The most recent one is Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for solidarity and social justice. In the last year and a half, she has co-directed the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker by the UNDP and UN Women, monitoring the responses of governments that want to address violence against women, women's economic security, and unpaid care in the context of the pandemic. So without further ado, if you're here with us, Mrs. Staab, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Mendes, and it is a pleasure to be here with you. I would like to thank the regional government of Andalusia for having invited me to be here with you. Sadly, because of the time difference, I have not been able to join you from the start, but I have been able to follow Libertad's presentation, and I hope we have some minutes to talk. I'm going to give my presentation in English because it is the language in which I feel more comfortable for technical issues, but I wanted to introduce myself in Spanish. I'm going to try to move the presentation. I don't know if you can see the slides moving or not. There you go.
So in this presentation, I will focus on two main things. In the first part, I will draw on data from the UNDP UN Women COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker to provide a gender perspective on the emergency response to the pandemic. In addition to presenting some of the findings from the tracker, I will also briefly talk about the methodology we used to do the gender analysis. This is obviously not a gender budget analysis. It's far from it, but I think it has potentially interesting elements for those of you who work on gender mainstreaming. The second part of the presentation will then be a bit more forward-looking, and here I will draw on UN Women's recently launched report, Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for sustainability and social justice, which was already mentioned, to outline some of the ways in which the recovery can be harnessed to regain some of the ground that women lost to the pandemic and promote gender equality alongside environmental sustainability and social justice in the years to come. So let me start with the Global Gender Response Tracker. The tracker, which UN Women developed jointly with UNDP, covers two main areas. The first one is where you can see the bar chart on the upper right, covers women's representation and leadership in COVID-19 response committees and task forces. It holds sex disaggregated data for over 130 countries, and finds that on average, women make up less than 24% of task force members and lead only 18% of task forces globally. I won't talk much about this dimension today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it should you have any in the Q&A. The second dimension looks at government responses to COVID-19, focusing on how they are addressing three main challenges for gender equality and women's rights that have intensified with the pandemic: the rising risk of gender-based violence, increased economic insecurity, acknowledging that at least globally, women have been particularly affected by the loss of jobs and livelihoods. I just heard Libertad talking about how in Spain there is no evidence as yet for strong gender differences here, but at least globally and in some regions, we see Very, very strong disadvantages for women here. And then finally, the intensified unpaid care demands, which Libertad and I'm sure others also talked about, particularly in the face of school and daycare closures, where evidence does suggest that women have picked up the lion's share. So before I share some of the results, I wanted to give you a sense about how the tracker is structured. Currently, the tracker holds almost 5,000 measures from 226 countries and territories. These measures fall into different policy categories. There are social protection measures, labor market measures, economic and business support measures, and measures that address violence against women. Within this broader universe of measures, we used a two-pronged approach to identify those that are gender sensitive. On the one hand, there are measures such as those that address violence against women, which are defined as gender sensitive by default. We collected most of the data on these measures ourselves with the help of our country and regional offices. On the other hand, we wanted to conduct more of a gender mainstreaming analysis of the broader economic, labor market, and social protection response. And so for this purpose, we imported large data sets from other existing trackers, including by ILO, World Bank, and other agencies, and then analyzed those measures from a gender perspective. To do so with this massive amount of measures, we asked two basic questions. First, is the measure aimed at strengthening women's economic security by prioritizing them, for example, for the receipt of cash transfers, for training, for food assistance, or by targeting female-dominated sectors or occupations of the economy with fiscal support? And second, does the measure address the rise in unpaid care work, for example, through special family leaves, childcare services for essential workers, or cash for care programs that compensate parents for school or daycare closures? And so what this allowed us to do is to show the proportion of gender sensitive measures within the broader response, and I'll return to that in a second. But first, I wanted to give you an overview of the gender responsive measures, the gender sensitive measures themselves. The tracker identifies a total of 1,605 gender sensitive measures across the policy category I mentioned and across 196 countries. More than half of these measures focus on stepping up action on violence against women. 853, as you can see on the screen. And as you can also see, fewer efforts were identified to target women's economic security or address unpaid care. Unpaid care in particular, only 226 measures, also across a much smaller set of countries, 93 compared to 163 for violence, and very much concentrated in advanced industrialized countries. This slide shows the basic results that I was talking about of the gender mainstreaming analysis for the global social protection and jobs response. As you can see, out of more than 3,000 social protection and labor market measures taken across 226 countries and territories, only just shy of 20% are gender sensitive as defined by our tracker. 7% address unpaid care and 12% address economic security. Yes, I see the interpreters. I can try to speak more slowly. Europe's proportion of gender sensitive measures is slightly higher than the global average, but more interestingly, perhaps, and perhaps surprisingly, Europe has more unpaid care measures and fewer measures aimed at women's economic security. And so I just wanted to briefly talk about why this could be the case. On the one hand, this has to do with how we operationalize the definition of measures for economic security as targeting or prioritizing women. This is less common and perhaps also less necessary in the European context than in many developing countries, because in Europe, existing social insurance and employment policies are more universal in scope. And so it is assumed that general protections against job and income loss, such as wage subsidies, unemployment benefits, and the like, do reach a large share of women as well, even though we know there can be barriers because of women's disadvantages in the labor market and the fact that they're often concentrated in the most vulnerable, unprotected, part-time agency work and so on. Developing countries, in turn, relied much more on non-contributory social assistance measures that are often targeted to specific groups, and among them, specific groups of women, such as pregnant women, women informal workers, migrant women, and others. On the other hand, the existing social policy architecture in Europe, particularly the pre-existence of paid family leaves, paid sick leaves with significant coverage, the existence of basic childcare service infrastructure, and so on, did enable a better response to the care crisis triggered by COVID-19, compared to much of the developing world, where this architecture is nascent, if at all available, and often covers a small proportion of the workforce, which is largely informal. Overall, however, even in Europe, the response has been insufficient to prevent serious rollbacks in terms of women's employment and economic security, as well as some of the gender dynamics in the unpaid division of labor at home, as we've heard previously. So next, let's look at the most common measures in the area of women's economic security. This figure shows the number of countries that register measures in each of the policy categories. By far, the most common measure we can see has been cash transfers that have targeted or prioritized women, or as per their design, can be assumed to benefit them disproportionately. This would be the case, for example, with cash transfers for domestic workers or support measures for single parents, both categories where women are significantly overrepresented. In Brazil, for example, Congress approved an emergency cash transfer in March 2020, which provided monthly benefits to almost 66 million informal workers over a 9-month period. And women heads of household received double the benefit in recognition also of their double burden as breadwinners and caregivers. Spain's guaranteed minimum income is also included here because it has additional benefits of €100 for each child in a single parent household. And most single parent households are, as we know, headed by women. The second next important category, and I won't go through all of them, but I wanted to give you some examples, are wage and unemployment subsidies. And here, a large proportion of measures are occupational hardship bonuses or wage increases for health workers, again, a group among which women are overrepresented in most countries. We've seen such temporary hardship bonuses in countries like Austria, Germany, Greece, Spain, Serbia, and many others. In France, as well, worth mentioning that a more permanent wage increase has been negotiated for health workers in the public and private sector, including heavily feminized and underpaid occupations like midwives and nursing home workers. The final thing I wanted to mention for this slide is that we see very few countries adopting activation and entrepreneurship measures that prioritize women. And that's, of course, a concern, particularly in countries where women have disproportionately been affected from job loss or dropped out of the labor force because of care demands at home. So what about the measures in support of unpaid care? Here we see that overall relatively few countries have such measures in place, but by far the most common response, particularly in Europe, was the extension of family leave and paid sick leave to take care of sick children or other relatives. We have 50 countries here in total, 33 of those I think are in Europe. Norway, for example, doubled the amount of childcare leave from 10 to 20 days for each parent. Italy increased paid leave for workers who provide care to elderly family members from 3 to 12 days per month during the pandemic. We've also seen measures to support the continued provision of childcare services or support safe reopening. Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and others all provided emergency services, for example, for essential workers, and some countries extended these emergency childcare services to other vulnerable groups. In addition, where schools and childcare services remained closed, several countries compensated parents through cash for care payments for these closures. Support for elder care services has been important, but insufficient, I would say, to make up for long-standing deficits in this sector. But we do have a couple of positive examples. Denmark, for example, allocated $15 million to municipalities to improve nursing home infrastructure and home-based care. And both Bulgaria and Spain have also allocated funds to reinforce home care for the elderly. So one important takeaway from the analysis of the emergency response is that when crises hit, governments largely respond with the systems and with the tools that are already in place. They scale up vertically, trying to increase benefits, for example, that are already available, or horizontally trying to bring in more groups under the coverage of already existing schemes. So what that means is that if social protection and labor market policies do not take gender inequalities into account in normal times, this is even less likely to happen under emergency conditions, which some people have referred to as the tyranny of the urgent, where governments really are very preoccupied with pushing money out of the door and generally don't take much time to consider the gender distributional consequences of the measures. And so this then takes me to the second part of the presentation and the question of how the recovery can be used to build back better, particularly in these areas. And we address this question in the recent report Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for sustainability and social justice. In it, we make an explicit link between the care and jobs crisis created by COVID-19 and the ongoing climate emergency, and highlight 3 priority areas for advancing towards a more sustainable and gender-just future. A job-led recovery with particular attention to enabling women's entry and re-entry into the workforce, investments in the care economy, and gender-responsive climate mitigation and adaptation policies. So one of the key priorities is really to engineer a job-rich recovery. And what we argue is that this needs to be accompanied by measures that enable women's re-entry into the workforce, including through training, job mediation, and placement opportunities. For Europe, young women are of particular concern given that they have suffered the most severe job losses. In high-income countries, for example, young women's employment shrank by 11.8%, almost twice as much as it did for young men. And so considering that European countries put in place an array of job retention measures designed to limit employment losses, it appears that these measures were not sufficiently effective for young people and young women in particular. And this is something that really needs to be addressed in the recovery phase if we don't want to leave those young women behind. As yet, there are very few, but some incipient examples. We've seen Chile and the Slovak Republic, for example, launching wage subsidy schemes for new hires that provide extra payments to companies who hire young people or women. And we've also seen Poland regional labor bureaus launching activation measures with a focus on young people and those among young people who have been most affected, including women, migrants, and persons with disabilities. Second, and very much relatedly to the point on jobs, we argue that public investments in the care economy should be a key pillar of the recovery. Affordable quality care services are critical to support women's participation in the labor force, as well as the well-being of children and older persons and other care-dependent persons. But what is important is that investments in the care economy can also drive a job-rich recovery. Evidence shows, for example, that across the OECD, public investments in care services could create 40 to 60% more jobs than the same investments in construction. They also have been shown to have really important fiscal multiplier effects that offset some of the initial fiscal outlay. Canada is one of the countries that has recognized this potential and proposed massive investments in universal childcare services and elder care infrastructure as part of its recovery strategy and budget plans for the next 5 years. As part of these investments, it is really important to also look at the working conditions and wages of workers in the care sector. While the pandemic has raised social recognition of these workers, many of the economic penalties and occupational health and safety hazard associated with paid care work remain unaddressed. Workers in the childcare and long-term care sector, overwhelmingly women, often migrant women, women of color, are particularly vulnerable. And so at the very least, we need to ensure that these workers are covered by basic labor and social protections and that their work is adequately remunerated. And there are some examples in the report as well of countries that have taken innovative measures in this regard. In New Zealand, for example, there was a landmark pay equity settlement for long-term care workers in 2017, which then ushered in a reform of the Equal Pay Act in 2020, enshrining the right to equal pay for work of equal value, which then basically entitled women in underpaid female-dominated sectors to receive the same remuneration as those doing equal value work in male-dominated sectors. Finally, there's a huge opportunity to harness climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies to promote gender equality and women's empowerment. And I want to highlight three main ways to do this here. First, it is estimated that transitioning away from fossil fuels will result globally in a loss of 6 million jobs, but it could also create 24 million new jobs. And so one of the key priorities is to support women to develop the skills they need to get a fair share of these opportunities. In Germany, for example, there is a national pact for women in STEM careers that promotes young women's participation in scientific and technical careers with a budget of 20.5 million between 2016 and 2021, coming to an end this year. Second, as sectors such as traditionally male-dominated sectors such as energy and transport are targeted for greening, governments can also promote women's participation in leadership in these sectors. Finland, for example, joined the Equal by 30 campaign, which aims to promote equal pay, leadership, education, and career opportunities for women in the clean energy sector, targeting both private and public companies. Finally, infrastructure investments, such as those aimed at greening housing and transport sectors, should and can be made with a gender and care lens. And this is one of my favorite examples, which some of you may have heard of. In Austria, the city of Vienna, for a long time has spearheaded gender responsive and inclusive urban planning, including with regards to land use and public transport. And this has included a focus on a city of short distances, in which mixed land use, residential, green space, leisure, services, shopping, and so on, is geared towards enabling people to combine paid work, family chores, shopping, service use, and so on. And so it enables children, caregivers, older persons, and people with disabilities to move much more independently through neighborhoods and access services. So in a nutshell, I think my message is that there is an important opportunity to use the recovery for promoting gender equality, social justice, and sustainable development. An opportunity, I will say, that was largely missed in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, where austerity measures rapidly ushered in a decade of economic stagnation and rising inequalities. So in many ways, today, the world is again at the crossroads, facing a choice between doubling down on the mistakes of the past or seizing the opportunity to do things differently. And we hope that our feminist plan provides some inspiration for the latter. So thanks very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions, comments, and feel free to use the hashtag if you liked or want to know more about the feminist plan. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Silke, por tu...
Thank you, Silke, for your presentation. I do indeed have a couple of questions that we had prepared after your presentation. And if you agree, I'd like to start off with the first one myself. The first has to do with the study you carried out analyzing the different measures during the pandemic, and it was a massive task to come up with all of that data. And I was wondering, do you have any plans to evaluate the policies afterwards to see, for example, how much impact in pragmatic terms those measures had on gender equality? Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Currently working on a final report that looks at all the measures that we've collected. There are, of course, as you have seen, 1,600 gender-sensitive measures in the tracker, so we won't be able to get even close to evaluating the impact of many of those measures. But what we do plan to do in this report is to combine the quantitative data from the tracker that gives a very good sense of kind of where the priorities were in terms of the response and the policy design, with more in-depth country case studies, regionally representative country case studies that would look at the impact of some of these measures. Another thing that we're currently doing, which is interesting, is to correlate the gender-sensitive measures that countries have taken with another set of data collection that we've engaged in during the pandemic. And those are rapid gender assessments in more than 50 countries that looked at the impact of the pandemic. And so what we're trying to assess is whether a stronger gender-sensitive response in some of those countries has reduced, is reflected in kind of more positive outcomes for women in these surveys. One example, for example, that we've already found is that in countries with more and better gender-sensitive measures targeted at women's economic security, women report, a higher proportion of women report receiving government assistance during the pandemic. So that's the kind of work we're carrying out for the forthcoming report, where I think we do address this gap that obviously can exist between measures that are being announced and adopted and the actual impact, and oftentimes the unintended consequences that these measures can have on the ground.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you. I have a second question, and in your presentation, you talked about caregiving, which is a key sector for our society, a care-based society. And in the experience that you've had in the global gender response tracker, what would you highlight as having the most long-term effect on caregiving that has an impact on gender equality between women and men?
In response to your question, to this broader point of really centering the care economy in the recovery and making it much more essential to how we conduct our economic and social policies. I think there are some specific things. Libertad mentioned some specific measures to encourage kind of men to take up a greater share of part-time arrangements and other things similar to what has happened with parental leaves. But I think what is more important, and where I see a much greater opportunity alongside, some of the examples that we see of this already happening, is to really invest strongly in the care sector as a motor for job creation, for decent job creation, jobs that are created for both women and men, and that enable families to reconcile paid employment and unpaid care much better than they do now. And there are, of course, countries we know where there are still huge gaps in terms of access to affordable childcare services. I mentioned the example of Canada recognizing this. And so for a long time in Canada, for example, child rights movements, women's movements, mobilized for a universal childcare service system. And I think what COVID did is to really bring that advocacy to a tipping point and convince the government that this is worth the investment, that this is worth the step taking, and to develop a long-term plan for really making childcare services available coast to coast. Another really interesting example, I think, is what has been happening in Latin America and some of the Latin American countries over the past years already, and I think which also received a renewed impetus through the pandemic, which are discussions over the development of integrated national care systems. So to really bring a range of stakeholders together, organizations that represent caregivers, organizations that represent people who depend on care, including older persons and persons with disabilities, to think about what kind of system do we need across sectors to really address care demands, make sure that people who need care receive quality care without overburdening and relying disproportionately on women's unpaid or underpaid labor. And so I think those are really interesting examples. In Uruguay, more consolidated, more emerging in Argentina, but we also see Colombia, Mexico, the Dominican Republic kind of latching onto this idea of integrated national care systems that combine social protection, public services, infrastructure investments to really address kind of the care needs of their societies in an integrated way.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias, Silke.
Thank you, Silke. I'd like to give the floor now to Alicia because she has, I believe, a number of other questions that she'd like to pose. Thank you, Silke. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And we are absolutely delighted to have you up so bright and early in New York to join us at this conference. I'd also like to ask you a question that we got from the audience that has to do with the green economy and the environment. As we all know that the climate change issues and environmental issues are also related to gender equality, because as you said, that the roles that women play in many sectors in society are imbalanced. And so it's absolutely primordial now for public policies to take both of these dimensions into account. That is the green economy on the one hand, environmental protection and mitigating climate change, and gender equality. And the region of Andalusia is trying to do that through green budgeting and gender perspective budgeting. So my question is, could you possibly say if the global gender response tracker has taken into account measures that imply both gender equality and environmental measures? Have you been able to detect any measures in which social protection measures have to do with gender equality and the environment? Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. I think this is a really important and a really interesting question. It's something that we're actually working on right now and are hoping to have some more data on in March. Some of you may know that in March, traditionally, there is the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, a big kind of intergovernmental negotiation, which next year will focus on climate change and environmental issues and the intersection with gender equality. So what we're trying to do right now is to identify a subset of measures from the tracker that tackles both gender equality and a green recovery. There is not a great deal on these of these measures. I think also reflecting the fact that overall, what we know from the data is that the potential for a green recovery from COVID-19 is far from realized. Most of the fiscal spending has not been green, right? So I think we're also at a point where we're still kind of have a lot of catch up to do in terms of making sure that the COVID response and continued response for the recovery is green, and then integrate a gender perspective into that. I think there are some interesting examples, even in areas where we didn't expect this. So, for example, in violence against women, responses in the Caribbean, we see efforts, for them, COVID wasn't the first disaster, right? They're used to disasters happening regularly with hurricanes and other natural disasters. And so they're working to make violence against women services much more shock responsive, to put systems in place to ensure that these during an emergency where they're particularly needed, but where access may be particularly challenging as well, can continue to operate. We've also seen a couple of measures where kind of, recovery efforts combine this effort to be green, but also enable women's re-entry into the labor force. So one of the good examples here is Costa Rica, a country with a long history of kind of green and environmental policies, supporting women's employment in these sectors and women's entrepreneurship in these sectors. But overall, I think we need to look much closer, and we also need to make sure that beyond COVID response, this continues to happen, because while we hope that COVID at some point will go away or will become manageable in the next few years for our societies, climate change will certainly be with us as a threat for many years to come.
Gracias, Silke. Sí, tenemos otra pregunta.
Thank you, Silke. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. And this is a more general question. I thought the presentation was interesting in the conclusion that public policy has to take gender equality into account even before crises occur. It has to be more systematic and organized. Are there any studies that show that gender equality measures are invested in before the pandemic actually occurred?
I'm not aware of. I think that's a really, really good question, and I think it's an area that is that would be really worth exploring. I don't know of any existing studies. As part of the report that I mentioned that we're doing on the tracker, we're trying to explore some of these hypotheses, right? And we're finding some relations, for example, of kind of more comprehensive responses in countries with a longer history of robust investments in their social protection systems. We also find evidence of kind of social protection systems where women were already targeted before the pandemic, being able to kind of get cash support to women who are struggling, who lost their jobs, who are affected by food insecurity, etc., relatively quickly, right? So one of the examples for this, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because we've seen these cash transfers across Latin America in particular that are targeting mothers and supporting mothers. Some research suggests that this also reinforces obviously the caregiving role of mothers, that it kind of intensifies, especially where it's tied to conditionalities, women's unpaid care burdens. But the fact that pretty broad-based systems that already channeled cash support to mothers were in place before the pandemic meant that during the pandemic, these very same systems could be used to scale up support as kind of the needs intensified, to scale up support to beneficiaries who were already part of the program, but also to branch out horizontally and make these benefits available to other groups who maybe before weren't covered. So I think there's some good kind of more qualitative evidence on some of these investments paying off during an emergency as well. And this is also why we argue so strongly that it's really important to invest in robust gender responsive social protection systems and labor market policies with the recovery, so that next time around we're better prepared to respond.
Muy bien. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Staab, for your presentation, for this magnificent Q&A. And with this, we are going to close today's session. I am going to give a general overview of what we have seen today as a conclusion. I think that today's session has been extremely interesting and rich. First of all, the regional minister said that gender perspective is essential for the regional minister for public finance and European funding. We believe it is a potential tool for transformation, and it is cross-cutting as it affects budget, and it allows to close the gaps between men and women. In this pandemic context that we have been discussing thoroughly during today's seminar, we have seen that the pandemic has affected differently both men and women in different areas. Each of our speakers have shed some light on a certain area, but if something is obvious, as we have seen, equality is a human right, and it is also an indicator of sustainable, equal, inclusive growth, and it is also indicative of just long-term growth. I'm now going to highlight some of the key messages of each speaker. Ms. Ziguadotti from the OECD has highlighted that budgeting processes are very important tools because they allow for better planning. Budgets are a cross-cutting instrument and allow us to reach precisely those gender inequalities and solve them. Gender budgeting and gender-responsive budgets can help to implement green budget as well in several countries. And for us in the region of Andalusia, that is one of our key objectives and challenges for the next few years. Ms. Trigavadottir has also stated something that the region of Andalusia is well aware of. In order for this implementation to be effective, we need awareness raising, we need data, and we need political commitment at the highest level. Secondly, Ms. Elizabeth Klatzer, researcher who has given us an overview with the EU recovery plan and how it has incorporated gender and gender equality. Her analysis was quite critical in some sort because in general, the EU could improve their incorporation of gender both in objectives and in indicators. She has also stated that Spain's recovery plan is quite thorough in gender matters, and it has incorporated gender policies and incorporates a change in the caring sector. She has also stated that we need to state concrete objectives in gender matters in our recovery and resiliency mechanisms, and also to address childcare, to address gender pay gap, and we need also an aftermath assessment with both qualitative and quantitative data. Ms. Libertad Gonzalez has talked about gender in the labor market. She has shown us the results of her survey and has shown us that the COVID-19 crisis has not had segregated effect, has not had a different effect on men and women in paid work. Nevertheless, the survey has shown, and this has been stated by both Ms. Gonzalez and by other speakers, we have seen that unpaid work has actually increased for women in both caring and taking care of household chores, which has been traditionally linked to women and is now more than ever. Overall, despite the working hours having decreased for both men and women, domestic working hours have increased for both men and women. But these increases have been even bigger for women than for men. She has also made some very interesting comments on the importance of telework. Remote work has affected more women, and it also allows for better work-life balance. In her presentation, she has suggested that in order to promote women participation in the labor market, we should increase co-responsibility through parental leave for men, also an increase in childcare leaves for men, and also to put an emphasis on the fact that women have already an overburden of unpaid work. Lastly, representative from UN Women, Ms. Silke Stab, has presented us with the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker that has been set up by the UN to assess the COVID-19 crisis. And it has indicated that out of the 3,000 social and economic protection measures, 19.6% of them have a gender lens. Most of these measures are addressed to fighting violence against women and girls, and to help domestic care. It is obvious that in the cases of a crisis, states need to use the tools that they have at their disposal before the crisis starts. That is why we don't have a gender perspective incorporated in our budget. It is going to be very difficult to respond to the crisis with a gender lens. That is why the public budget needs to be aligned with our gender objectives and to monitor the effect that our public policies have on gender. Having said this, and in order to close my statement, I would like to thank the F.P.A Foundation and the staff of the Regional Ministry and of the General Secretariat for having organized today's session. I would like to thank the production team for their spotless work, and I would like to thank you all for being here today and for having participated so actively on the chat. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the speakers. I hope that this session was useful for you. I think that we can extract many interesting lessons from today's conference, and see you next time. I hope that we will see you there. Thank you.